The sermon today is broken into two parts because I want to explain the series, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about perfectionism. On June 13th of this year, this past June, this congregation voted on affirming and including an additional principle to the 7 that the Unitarian Universalist Association affirms. We are one of 117 congregations and 20 UU organizations that have now passed the 8th principle, an act that we hope will influence our denomination to take similar action. The 8th principle states, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant and affirm to promote, and this is where the 8th principle starts, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Now, some people didn't like how wordy it was. Some didn't like that it wasn't parallel to the other principles. But most people who discussed this principle in our congregation agreed. It is not a passive statement. It calls us to action. So here we are in this program year, this most interesting year, and we are being called to act on this 8th principle. And how are we going to do that? Well, here's one way that I'm going to do it, is I'm going to be having a sermon series throughout this year on the characteristics of white supremacy culture and the antidotes for them. These characteristics have become well known in activist circles, and I personally have found them very useful in understanding how the culture I live in, like Rose so well explained, how that culture works against living into the ideal, my ideal, of an anti-racist multicultural society. I hope that they are going to be helpful to you as well. The characteristics of white supremacy culture were first published by Tima Okun with help from his mentor and collaborator, the late Kenneth Jones, in 1999. Okun has continued to refine them and incorporate learnings about them through the several anti-racism publications and workshops that he has. And they have been discussed and reviewed in a lot of different ways through activist works. Okun says, culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so difficult to name or identify. The characteristics listed below are damaging because they are used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by the group. They're damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. Because we all live in a white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in the attitudes and behaviors of all of us, people of color and white people. Therefore, these attitudes and behaviors can show up in any group or organization, whether it is white-led or predominantly white, or people of color-led or predominantly people of color. Okun is very clear that these characteristics are not the way to understand white supremacy culture. Instead, they are one way. And there is a lot to unpack to even understand the term white supremacy culture, which some of you may bristle at. But for these purposes, we're going to be discussing it similar to how Rose described it, as the water we swim in, the water that is defined mostly by white cultures and norms, that looking at the culture that we are in and saying, is that everyone's culture? Is that the culture we want? And in order to break down the racism that exists in our culture, we need to break down the culture itself. So this year, we are going to consider perfectionism, urgency, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, fear of open conflict, and individualism. The others, defensiveness, the idea that there is one right way, Paternalism, either or binary thinking, power hoarding, the right to profit, the right to comfort, and objectivity are also important. And I think you will see them all show up as we're talking about the others. In fact, Akun has now bundled several of these together because the braids are so tightly woven to be pulled apart. My great hope is that by exploring these characteristics, you will be able to engage in a deeper reflection of the cultures that exist in your communities, families, and this congregation. I hope that you will be willing to conduct an honest inventory of how these characteristics have not served you or the larger culture. And I hope you will be willing to explore the antidotes as tools in building the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. described. Now, I need to make a major caveat. I am going to be using the term and have our culture often in these sermons. And I want to be clear that I'm talking about Western Judeo-Christian culture, especially how it manifests in the United States. This is a predominantly white culture, and this culture affects everyone, no matter what your skin color is. But clearly, it affects some of us in different ways and in different extremes. Akun says this about it. While white supremacy culture affects us all, harms us all, and is toxic to us all, it does not affect, harm, and violate us in the same way. White supremacy targets and violates BIPOC people and communities with the intent to destroy them directly. White supremacy targets and violates white people with a persistent invitation to collude that will inevitably destroy their humanity. Our experience of white supremacy culture and our navigation of white supremacy culture is very different based on who we are and our lived experience, our race, our class, our gender, our sexuality, our religion, all the ways that the ruling class or the power elite use to identify or define who is human and who is not, as well as all the way that oppressions intersect. White supremacy culture is inextricably linked to all of the other oppressions: capitalism, sexism, class and gender oppression, ableism, ageism, Christian hegemony. All of these and more are all interconnected and intersected and stirred together in a toxic brew that is reflected in our devastation of the air and the water and the land and living beings we have and are destroying and disregarding in the name of profit and power. So I invite you into this discernment of how we actively dismantle racism through looking at the culture that perpetuates it. I hope it inspires you, it clarifies for you, and maybe makes you just uncomfortable enough. And I give so much gratitude for this community where we can do this work together, Mary. So I was one of the kids who cried when she got a B in school, legitimately. Now, I was smart and I was hardworking, but I had gotten it ingrained in my head somehow that I had to do two things to be worthy as a child, I guess even a human being, really. I needed to behave, whatever that meant, and I needed to be an excellent student. What a crock of baloney. Really? How many sleepless nights did I spend worrying about a single test of something that I don't even remember now? How many tears did I shed worried that a teacher was going to be disappointed in me? Now I know teachers have much more things on their brains. And how much energy did I spend worrying about how others evaluated me rather than figuring out who I was as a human? Now, my mom always reassured me that my B was good enough. although I need to note that a C would have been problematic. But it was more than my parents. I was affirmed for getting all A's by relatives, the school system, colleges, and my peers. I was told my A's would help me to be whatever I wanted to be. Again, it was kind of a crock full of dog excrement. Kuhn says that perfectionism shows up in several ways. One is about the acknowledgement or appreciation. Perfectionism means that there is little or no appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing. And that when appreciation is expressed, it is often or usually directed to those who get most of the credit anyway. Instead, the majority of the focus is usually on how the person or the work is inadequate. And usually that isn't even done to the person directly. It's done through talking to others. There's not enough attention on what is going well, and instead there's a hyper-vigilance in what is wrong or needs corrected. I felt that. Instead of saying, oh, Christine, you got 98% of the questions right, I obsessed over the 1 or 2 that I missed. But what is even more tragic is how imperfections are seen. And let's be honest, we're all imperfect, right? We all acknowledge that. But perfectionism says that mistakes are personal, meaning that they reflect badly on the person making them, as opposed to being seen for what they are, mistakes. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake. Doing wrong is confused with being wrong. Wow, that's icky. There is also damage that is done internally for the perfectionist. Usually this perfectionism is so internalized that the person fails to appreciate their own good work. How many times is it seen as humble or self-deprecating to say, oh no, it wasn't that good. I screwed up here and here and here. Isn't it much more culturally acceptable to point out our faults or our failures? Bragging about our accomplishments is not as acceptable. I think that's kind of awful. So here's another awful part of perfectionism is who gets to define what is perfect? My math teacher? My parent? A community leader? Myself with standards that I couldn't ever achieve? Perfectionism assumes that we know what the standard is, and that standard is often defined by a narrow group of people, most often those who exist in white upper middle class paternalistic environments. So this affects everyone. It affects people of color, of course, but also those of us who are white and who live and identify as poor or working class. Those folks are under constant pressure to try to navigate this, to figure out, adapt to, assimilate into, and support this perfectionistic thinking and standards that they have little to no say in defining. For example, poor and working class white people almost always have to adopt upper middle class ways of talking or writing if the desire is to move up the hierarchies of power economically and socially. Kuhn is saying many of these things, I am adapting them liberally as I'm sharing them to you. For many folks of color, there is a feeling that you have to be super, ultra, mega perfect to fit in, or you just have to give up. You have to not only fit into these culturally defined ideas of perfectionism, but you have to exceed them as a person of color, and even more so if you are a female person of color. This feeling of needing to be exceptional can be paralyzing and impossible. It leads to tremendously destructive behaviors and even more of the feeling that one is never enough. Whew. Is anyone else feeling overwhelmed by this? Is anyone else feeling like they have been part of this part of the culture at one point or another in their life, or still maybe is? So we've established that this is harmful, not just for us individually, but impossible to achieve and an incredibly subjective thing to measure, except for those who are establishing the guideposts in the first place. So what are the antidotes to this culture? It's a lot of unprogramming, much of which many of you have already figured out. Like Carrie's comfortable house, it is understanding what is important to you and placing the unrealistic expectations to the side. For organizations, it means developing a culture of appreciation where the organization takes time to make sure that people's work and efforts are appreciated. When I think of this, I think of what happens behind the scenes in our worship services. I wish you all could see us. We are affirming and cheering. We are problem solving. We are rejoicing. We have the assumption that something will go wrong, and we are delighted and surprised when it doesn't. We appreciate the pieces that each of us add to the puzzle that is this weekly worship service. Just think about how good that would feel if we did this in every group we had. We also need to think of every single group that we might be in here at UUCP and outside as learning groups. It is expected that everyone will make mistakes and that those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. In these kinds of organizations, people realize that mistakes sometimes lead to positive results. They often can, and they're inevitable. So let's embrace them. The other thing we can do is write out of our UU first principle to acknowledge the worth and dignity of every person. We are capable of separating the person from the mistake. We can see and acknowledge the intent even when the impact is harmful. We can be generous of our support in finding ways to correct mistakes and affirming when they do. We do not have to label the person as bad when a mistake is happening. Why would we do that and still keep ourselves whole? And then, of course, some of the work is internal. That internal critic needs a hug. I learned that being my own critic did not actually improve my work. Instead, it just made me feel bad. It made others feel bad around me, and it did not make me learn anything so I could do it better the next time. Instead, we have the opportunity to celebrate the amazing, beautiful, unique, and imperfect creatures that we are, and that everyone else is too. We can shout out to the world our worth and awesomeness. So here's the trick, and you can tell everybody that your minister told you that you are dismantling white supremacy in order to stand on top of your desk and proclaim how awesome you are. Yep, please tell them that I said so. And do it for everyone else you are interacting with. And it is dismantling white supremacy to not be perfect and not to expect it of other people. This has been hugely liberating for me because it's like, look at me, I'm not perfect. I'm doing anti-racism work. And right here at UUCP, we are going to have the perfect opportunity to practice being imperfect. Last week, the staff, the board, and I agreed on a set of guidelines for when and how to reopen our campus slowly, flexibly, and with an eye towards consent and inclusion. And you know what? I can already guarantee that the guidelines are imperfect. We are going to be imperfect in implementing them. And we are going to practice showing each other appreciation and understanding. And we're going to use each opportunity that we mess up as a way to do it better, with even more appreciation and understanding. What if we lived in that house that had no mirrors, and our self-definition was crafted by the love we saw in each other's eyes? What would happen if we could let go of the impossible standards that are set by a small group of people that already have all the power? And what if we opened up ourselves to be authentically whole, feeling the abundance of the gifts that each person has to offer? What if we let go of the shackles of other people's expectations in order to find out what we really wanted for ourselves and our communities? Don't you see how that would make us more loving, supportive, and diverse? Personally, I like that vision rather than try that again. See, there's me being imperfect. Personally, I like that vision rather than the necessity to get all A's. I hope you all can join me in creating that vision, in living into our 8th principle, to becoming that beloved community. So might it be.